nobody seemed to be able to identify really what the problem was. The only person who actually advised me about lifestyle changes and diet was actually Estrelita. You know, I had a heart monitor installed, a cardiac monitor. The problem was actually my heart kept stopping. And really the only thing we did to change that was actually to change my dietary habits.
Welcome to the Lifestyle First podcast, discussing lifestyle medicine and making self-care as easy as 1, 2, 3. And now your host, lifestyle medicine physician and coach, Dr. Alka Patel.
Hi, hey, and hello, and welcome to Series 10, Episode 3 of the Lifestyle First podcast. Now, this week we are on F for food, and the one question that we're exploring today is, how does the food I eat affect my metabolic health? So, to help answer that question, I have with me Dr. Estrelita van Rehnsburg and Issy Warrack from Wellness IQ. Dr. Estrelita, she has a medical and a pharmaceutical background, whilst Issy's background is much more in the commercial property industry, but both have experienced very different lifestyle-related conditions in the last decade, and I'm sure we'll be hearing about those. And they've discovered really how conventional dietary beliefs have fueled these conditions, so much so, in fact, that they're both now very, very focused on helping others to improve their metabolic health through food. So I'm delighted to welcome you both. Welcome, Issy. Welcome, Dr. Estrelita, as well.
Thank you, Alka.
Thank you so much, Alka. It's a great pleasure to be here. We're looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So look, let's get going on this topic. Let's maybe start by talking about definitions, just so that we're sure we're all on the same page here. I'd love to just start with what is your definition of metabolic health and metabolism, just so that we're clear on what we all mean today.
So I'll try to answer that, Alka. I think metabolic health is kind of the basis for what goes on in our body and how, the nutrients that we eat deliver energy to our cells to process all the functions and interactions that's needed to live a healthy life. I think what is also important when we talk about healthy metabolic health, that's really the natural process. That's without, the support of medication and so on. So the way we're designed to work naturally, that is what I see as a good summary of what metabolic health is.
Okay, so that's very broad, isn't it, in terms of how we function naturally and for our health. So it's very much about energy processes as well, from what you've described as well. And as you say, food plays a huge part in that. So maybe we can then talk about some of these misconceptions when it comes to food and health and metabolism. Issy, maybe what do you believe are the most common misconceptions when it comes to food and health in your experience?
Well, that's actually an interesting question, Alka. I think the advice given these days is often inaccurate. I can only speak from my own personal experience, although obviously I have observed many others. And from my point of view, I was advised to follow a diet, and I hate the word diet, but we'll just call it a diet because everybody else does. I was advised to follow a low-fat diet. That's a complete myth. Fat actually doesn't make you fat, but I'll leave Estrelita to explain that more. I was also advised perhaps to follow more of a vegetarian concept and to focus myself not eating very much red meat, follow white meats, and also to eat meat without fat content. So those for me are the myths which are exploited by the food industry, and for my health were completely inaccurate. Maybe you might want to comment on that.
Well, Alka, I'll come from it more from a medical and epidemiological perspective, because very interesting, if we look at health data over the 20th century, we see that there are several lifestyle diseases that really increased in prevalence. And I'm talking about, I'll take the three most obvious ones, is obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. And these three conditions progressively increased over the 20th century. It's still doing in the 21st century as well. But what is very interesting, if you look at the graphs, that there was a change round about 1980, when all of a sudden, the prevalence just escalated exponentially, where it was previously kind of, on a different trajectory. And the question we should ask ourselves, what actually happened in 1980? And if we go back, the change that happened was very significant, because that was when the US actually introduced their new dietary guidelines for Americans. And it's the first time in the history that a government actually started telling its population what to eat. Now, this was during the Nixon administration. And what was the advice that they gave Americans? To eat less fat, because there was a belief, and that started in the 1950s, that fat and cholesterol are the causes of heart disease. And that's a completely unfounded theory, even though we were all taught that in medical school. And I'm sure, when you studied, similar beliefs were actually taught to people here in the UK. I'm originally from South Africa. And the second thing that they then said, if you decrease your fat content, you have to increase something else in your diet. Now, there are only three macronutrients. That's protein, fat, and carbohydrates. So protein is kind of constantly taken in as a percentage, about 20% of the diet. So the only other thing that could increase was carbohydrates. So the guidelines then suggested that carbohydrate content increased dramatically, fat decreases, and the suggestion was that if you eat fat, you need to eat low-fat products. And the results we could then see, that happened within a few years after these guidelines were introduced in America. The UK followed in 1983 by introducing the Eat Well guide that one can find on the NHS website. And most of the other English-speaking Western countries followed suit. So this led to a massive epidemic of obesity, diabetes, and many other related lifestyle diseases. And we can chat a little bit about why this change in dietary preference actually had the opposite effect of what the intention initially was.
No, thank you for that. So thank you for taking us through the epidemiology. I think it's always very useful sometimes to look back so that we can then look forward as well and utilize that information to really propel us into really understanding what are perhaps some of the mistakes we've made and why there has been so much confusion. And you can imagine from the sort of public's perception, from everyday person who's looking at the fronts of newspapers and adverts on buses and the fronts of magazines, which are propelling more and more of this information as well, is that it gets very difficult to ignore those words and the advertising and the information that we're being given as well. And I think it's a real calamity, isn't it? The word fats and fat are so associated together that in itself is where some of the confusion really lies, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely, Elke. And one of the great myths is that eating fat makes you fat. It's actually not true. And of the three macronutrients that I mentioned, only 2 of those are essential for us as humans to be healthy. And the 2 are protein and fat, not carbohydrates. Actually, we can live a very happy and healthy life without eating any carbohydrates. Now, if we look at the composition of foods, and this is also the whole movement which is very much driven by the food and drink industry, because most of their product is based on carbohydrate and sugar content. Because we also need to understand that sugar and carbohydrates are really the same thing. Because if you look at the chemical structure of sugar, it's just one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose, which breaks down into the two components. But what is carbohydrates or starch? If we think of starch like potatoes, bread, pasta, rice, starch is nothing else chemically than a lot of glucose molecules holding hands. So when we digest starch, our enzymes break it down to individual glucose molecules. So our body only sees glucose, whether it comes from sugar or whether it comes from potatoes, doesn't matter. And glucose has a very specific response in the body, because when you eat it, your body excretes the hormone insulin. And actually, insulin is driven to a great extent by carbohydrates, much less so than by eating proteins or fats. Fats almost have no impact on insulin secretion. And insulin is a very, very important hormone because it's necessary to take glucose molecules into our cells where it's metabolized for energy. But once we have enough energy in our cells, what happens to the excess glucose that is there? Well, the body then stores it in our livers as glycogen, but there's a limited capacity in our liver to store glycogen. The rest is actually stored as fat, and it's usually stored as fat in and around our abdominal organs. And that's how we see, as we move on in age and getting older, that our waistline expands. And that's a clear sign that we're eating too much carbs and that those carbs are changed into fat. That's a critical thing that I never understood. I never understood that fat comes from excess carbohydrates or sugar.
Yeah. So thank you again for clarifying some of those pathways as well. I think the diet debates are going to rage on forever and a day, aren't they? And we'll find research and information and evidence for lots of different concepts around what is the right food to eat. And Issy, you started off by telling us that you were perhaps given the wrong advice. And I always think it's important to start with the end in mind, to know what is that end goal specifically related to your choice of food, because obviously we've all got a different end goal. Perhaps we've all got different metabolic pathways in terms of how they affect us. We've all got different needs in terms of our output, our activities, our day-to-day lives. So Issy, can I ask you, what was that? Was there a particular end goal in mind that didn't fit the food choices that you were led to believe might be most helpful for you? Because I think it's very difficult to say, here's the one diet and here it is for everybody, no matter how hard we find using that word diet itself, which actually, if you go back to the root of words, it simply means a way of eating. And that's how we should be using the word. But unfortunately, again, it's linked to so much else, isn't it? But back to that question about the end in mind. What was that end in mind for you when you were given advice regarding food?
Well, I think I had, there are sort of three particular events that I can think of. So I'll go back in history, if I may, because the first time, and this was many, many years ago, when I was advised actually to stop eating dairy, full stop, and to change it to soy milk or soy products. That in turn, if I'd known what the end result for that was, which was actually a thyroid issue, I wouldn't have followed that advice. So my end goal there, I thought, was actually to live more healthily. And, I think everyone wants to live more healthily. I did have another incident about 10 years ago where, it was a bit of a wake-up call, but I wasn't actually quite as sure. But I think the question that you're asking me now is actually when I had what I describe as an event, where I had heart palpitations. I kept fainting on planes. I had a few major falls. And I actually thought, I'm a grandmother, so I'm not in my first youth, but I'm certainly still pretty sharp. But I actually felt personally as if I was going rapidly downhill. My health was deteriorating. I could feel it. I had no energy. I could hardly be bothered to go up the stairs. I used to think about whether I needed to go up the stairs or not. And I just wondered where all my get up and go had gone. Nobody seemed to be able to identify really what the problem was. And to this day, actually, the only person from the medical field, and I'm not saying we haven't actually seen some great people, the only person who actually advised me about lifestyle changes and diet was actually Estrelita. I had a heart monitor installed, a cardiac monitor for 3 years to see what was causing the problem. And the problem was actually my heart kept stopping. So no wonder I had some issues. And really the only thing that we did to change that was actually to change my dietary habits, for want of a better word. And I think my end goal when I was at my lowest health was, well, actually, to be honest with you, I just wanted to live. But as I started to get better, I saw that actually I had decades still ahead, whereas in fact, actually at one point it looked like years. And so my end goal was to actually achieve optimal health and to be able to continue to still have creativity, ideas. So I've actually achieved my end goal, but it takes work. And I'm very grateful because I'm glad that Estrelita actually had researched nutrition in such a way that we found a program that actually suited me,
If I can come in there, Elke, I think you're absolutely right. People respond differently to what they eat. So there is I believe, a genetic element there. And I mentioned the hormone insulin just because most of these lifestyle diseases that we talk about today are linked to high insulin levels, hyperinsulinaemia, as we call it. And that's related to diseases that we always thought were completely unrelated, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, and so on. What has these diseases got in common? Really nothing, I would say. But there is, because a lot of them, or most of them, have high insulin levels. And the condition that we're talking about, and that's almost never diagnosed in the clinic, is insulin resistance. And that happens when it's diet that makes insulin levels go up. And if we're very sensitive to carbohydrates, our cells and our tissues may become resistant to the effect from insulin. And the thing that happens then is insulin can't take glucose into our cells any longer. So we become energy deficient, our cells. Let me take an example. If we think about Alzheimer's disease, that's really the brain and especially the hippocampus area, which first becomes insulin resistant. So these neurons become deficient in energy, they die, and that's where memories are stored. Now, it was already in 2005 that somebody suggested that Alzheimer's should be called diabetes, type 3 diabetes, or diabetes of the brain. And that makes sense because 80% of people with Alzheimer's, for instance, also have type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is really insulin resistance of our muscles. And so we can carry on and on and on. Now, not everybody that eats a lot of carbohydrates are going to become insulin resistant. But if we think the estimations these days are that about 70, 80, maybe 85% of the US population is really insulin resistant, and the majority don't realize it because this disease takes years and decades to manifest itself. So most of the time we're completely unaware that our metabolic health is not optimal. because it's such a delayed process before symptoms start to appear.
And we're living, aren't we, in a really wonderful time in a way where technology is advancing at such a rate that actually we can now have an internal look at what we couldn't look at before. So taking your example of insulin resistance and glucose, we can now put continuous glucose monitors on our arms and actually know what happens when we bite into that apple or have those potatoes for our dinner. And that data that we can then capture ourselves is so individualized and personalized to you that we now no longer have to pull diets off the shelf and follow the off the shelf diets, do we? We can actually really personalize our own eating habits, our own food choices to exactly what our personalized data is showing us. What's your view on the increasing use of personalized glucose monitoring?
Absolutely love it, Elke. I think it's a wonderful invention, and we actively encourage our clients, especially people with diabetes, to use the monitor because they get so sick and tired of pricking their fingers for a little bit of blood. But it's convenient. We both have tried it. I mean, we're not diabetic, but we wanted to monitor it, and it's so easy to use. It is so informative, and it's a great teaching tool because people can now see clearly what happens when they drink a glass of fruit juice or a glass of wine, or maybe eat 2 chocolates, as opposed to good quality protein, animal protein, good quality protein with a lot of fat. I did mine over December, and I was absolutely surprised having a good, healthy meal, and my blood sugar almost didn't change. But as soon as when I mentioned one of the other things that I took, it just shoots up. So it's absolutely great.
Yeah, no, I totally, completely agree with them. We're absolute advocate as well. And the more data you can capture on yourself, have some fun enjoying it, try a few things out, really get to know your numbers. That will actually fuel you to make more specific changes rather than someone else telling you more of this or less of that. Because I certainly know from, my years as a doctor as well, is telling somebody what to do does not mean that they're going to really have to have this sense of self, don't you, as well. So
absolutely. And as you say, what you measure, you can improve.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, 100%. So, Issy, just going back to, you mentioned you wanted your creativity back and to add years to your life and decades as well. And of course, you then went away and wrote this wonderful book with Dr. Estrelita, Eat Well or Die Slowly. Do you want to just give me a little bit of insight into what are the key elements in this book that you really highlight?
Well, the aspect of the book that I wrote was actually more on the food that we ate. I lived and grew up on a farm, and my mother was a farmer, and I used my experience and my memories of what we ate when I was a child, and the types of food that we ate. And so Estrelita wrote the medical side. I tended to focus more on the food. We ate meat because we lived on the farm. We also had fresh vegetables. My mother was a very keen gardener, so we ate vegetables. We did eat a lot of green leafy vegetables, but we also ate root vegetables in season because guess what? That's what you ate. And there weren't all the exotic fruits that there are in the supermarkets now. So we ate fresh food. And I think that was one of the messages that we have in our book, is to actually eat real nutritious food. And the other thing was we actually ate our meals on a regular basis. And guess what? We didn't snack. There was no snacks. So we ate regular meals, not too much because actually we weren't necessarily that hungry. Of course, we're hungry, but if you're having regular meals and your blood levels are kind of the same, you just eat until you're full. So, and yes, I'm not saying that we didn't have the occasional cake because people did come to tea and things like that. But by and large, we ate really well. And so I wrote on the experiences of that, and also the experiences of what actually was happening with the soil and the use of fertilizers, which started. I can remember it. So it started in the 60s. And, prior to that, actually one just fertilized with whatever natural products, one byproducts of, the cow manure on the farm, etc. So I then focused on the sort of deprivation of soil nutrients from then on, which of course has been ever increasing. The more fertilizer you put on, whilst it might make the crops grow big, it doesn't actually enhance the soil in any way. So that was my aspect of it.
So given then soil depletion and metabolic health, what are your views, perhaps, Dr. Estrelita, on supplementation? Because perhaps our food isn't really containing all that it needs to, even if it is coming out of the ground. What are your views on supplements when it comes to your metabolic health?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think, it really depends on what we eat. And if we can take two big categories, maybe vegetarian a diet versus a more carnivore diet and so on. It depends on the combination of micronutrients that's in the food that we eat. So we do know that animal-based diet is nutrient dense, meaning that it's got all the micronutrients that we need, including all the amino acids, all the essential amino acids. Well, if we follow a more plant-based diet, there are some notable deficiencies, and I can give you a couple of those. For instance, from the micronutrients, vitamin B12 we don't find in plant-based food. We know that with iron, for instance, the only iron based in plant-based food is non-heme iron, which is about 3 times less bioavailable for the body to use. Another important one is vitamin A, where we do find beta-carotene in plant-based foods, but not retinol. That's the vitamin A type that we find in animal-based food. And retinol is much more bioavailable than beta-carotene need to be changed over to retinol. And that's not a very efficient process in the body. So I would say for people that choose to follow a more plant-based diet, need to be aware of this. And I would think it's much more important for them to think about taking good supplementation. Things like vitamin D3, definitely B12. And another one that's very important is omega-3. Omega-3 is so important for brain function. And the two subcomponents of the omega-3 that's important for us is EPA and DHA. Don't ask me to give you the full scientific name. But DHA is very important for memory and cognitive functions. And about 2/3 of our brain is made up of DHA and fats. So unfortunately, the precursor of these two components are found in plants, but the body, once again, can't make these two components very effectively from ALA, which is the precursor. So only 1 to 6% of that is changed into the active components that we can use. So I think it's very important, based on your diet type, to make use of supplements, and good quality supplements. I know this was a very long answer. So yes, I think in general, supplements is a good thing.
And now, here is your lifestyle first prescription. Your 3 activating actions to take you from knowing to doing.
And I think perhaps back to what we said originally, which was measure. Ultimately, we've got access to being able to measure. So measure and only
Absolutely.
what will you know, as opposed to sort of more sweeping generalizations that are easy to grab onto. So wonderful. This has been really, really helpful, and really getting us back to the core of our metabolic pathways and the importance of our nutrients as well. So I'd love you now, if you could, is just to leave us with 3 very core actions that listeners can take to really enhance their metabolic health. What would those 3 be?
Well, we had a bit of a chat about that recently. I think it needs to be easy things for people. The first thing is a very, very easy thing to do. Ask people to just take a measuring tape, measure your waist and measure your height, say in centimeters. Mm-hmm. What you then do is you take your waist measurement and you divide it by your height measurement. And the ideal value should be 0.5 or less. If it's more than 0.5, that means that you've got too much abdominal fat. That's an indication that you're storing fat. That's an indication that you have too much insulin, and that's an indication that you are eating too much carbs and sugar. That is a very good proxy for insulin resistance. And if you get a higher value, I think it needs to be a warning sign, and people need to do something about that. The second thing that we would, let me just see.
You need to get the right one.
Second one. Coming back to carbohydrates, unfortunately, that's the culprit is, everybody say, count your calories when you eat. We say, not important, count your carbs. There's some very good apps out there where you can just put in what you eat and it will give you a daily carb count. If you're insulin resistant, we suggest that you keep your carb count very low, 20 to 25 grams of carbs a day, until you've been able to, get metabolically healthier. And that's something that we can help as well. And the last thing is eat good natural fats. Don't eat low-fat products. Eat good full-fat dairy products. Saturated fat is very healthy because if you eat low-fat products, you can't absorb your fat-soluble vitamins, your vitamin A, D, E, and K. So it's so important for your brain and your overall health. So those are 3.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. And they're very helpful. Get that measure tape out and then do something with that, with the numbers, count your carbs, and again, be wise to doing something with the numbers and choose your natural fat. So thank you so much for that. And I'm sure people are going to want to know more about what you do, how you work. What's the best way to get in touch with you?
I think the best way to get in touch is probably through our website. We'll send you the link, but it's wellnesseq.net. We've got an info section there. There's masses of information on there, and there's also the facility to contact us on the contact form there. So I think that's the best way.
Perfect. I will put those details up onto the podcast notes as well. And you have a plan as well. You've got an optimizer plan on your website as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a 12-week step-by-step plan, and it's really just to teach people how to eat healthily for their metabolic health. So very easy, it's very practical, a lot of easy recipes, even for busy people, professional people, people that don't have a lot of time, even people that don't cook. It's really easy, and I think it just teaches people what is good, what is bad, what they should do and what they should avoid. And we have a special discount for your listeners as well, if they're interested to join up.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, that's great. I'll definitely put those links as well with the discount code as well on the podcast notes, because if it's easy, then I'm sure it's going to be very, very interesting as well. So thank you so much for everything that you've both shared with us today. It really has been incredibly useful and very informative, and plenty of practical tips for all of us as well. So thank you so much. And that simply leaves me to wish everyone listening a happy, healthy day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elke.
Thanks for joining us on the Lifestyle First podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and share. To learn more, please visit www.dralkapatel.com.